As someone who has a fascination with the everyday experiences of people, I'll often fantasize about what my life would have been like if I lived in a different point during history. What would I eat? How would I spend my free time? And what were all those unspoken social rules that I would need to know in order to get by? And then, a little while ago, I had a realization. Either I would have died from something like smallpox as a baby, or I would be a spinster. That's right. At the ripe old age of 25, despite the fact that I still have the face of a teenager and long to eat dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets, I would be considered an old maid. And that got me thinking, what did a woman do once she became a spinster? So I did some digging, and it turns out that the life of a single woman in the 1800s is a lot more interesting than you might think. So join me, dear viewers, as today we take a look at the history of the spinster, explore the world of the early career woman, and find out if maybe a life alone wasn't so bad after all. So let's start off by asking, what is a spinster? Well, the general definition of the word is a woman, especially an older one, who has never married. The term is also usually accompanied by a negative connotation. Spinsters are often portrayed as being ugly, strange, or desperate for a husband. And alongside spinster, you might also see terms like crone, old maid, or crazy cat lady thrown around. But the exact details of what made a spinster would change depending on the era. Sometimes you were a spinster if you were just older than 18 and still unmarried. Other times it was once you were pushing 30. When looking at the Regency era, you often see a range of about 22 to 25. No one really agrees on the exact age. Also, according to some people on Twitter a few years back, once you reach 26, you would be called a thornback, which actually sounds cool as hell, but I couldn't find any reputable sources that actually back this up, so take that with a grain of salt. But being a spinster has not always been a bad thing. The original use of the term described those who spun wool for a living. This occupation was one of the few that was available to women, and was usually taken up by those who never married as a means to support themselves. By the 1700s, however, spinster became not only a word for the actual occupation, but also as a way to designate unmarried women in census records. This connection between spinning and single women is what eventually allowed the word to evolve into its later form. But over time, spinster would also begin to pick up those negative connotations, referring to a woman who not only spun yarn and was unmarried, but a woman who was deemed undesirable and a failure in the eyes of society for not fulfilling her role as a wife and mother. But how does somebody actually become a spinster? Were they really all women who were too unappealing to marry? Well, that might have been the case for some, but for most, the reason is far more interesting. The typical narrative that we see surrounding unmarried women in the 19th century usually depicts single life as being the result of either a lack of opportunities or the means to find a husband. Common stereotypes include women remaining single because they were undesirable, either because of their appearance, personality, or financial means. These women are also often shown to be desperate to find a husband regardless, and we have to assume that for some, there was truth to this. Not only were women raised around the idea that marriage was their ultimate goal in life, but in most cases it was also her only hope for financial stability. At the same time, however, we start seeing something really interesting happen throughout the latter half of the century. All of a sudden, the number of spinsters began to steadily increase, and this happened for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there was a lack of men. 1851 census records in Britain show that there were approximately 500,000 more women than men in the country's population, and 2.5 million unmarried women. This made sense, of course. Men have always had higher mortality rates, they have a tendency to die in wars or workplace accidents, and they were also more likely to emigrate to the other British colonies. So the increase in spinsters didn't come about because all these women were undesirable, but rather because there simply weren't enough husbands to go around. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. The Victorian era also saw an interesting shift happen in the way that people perceived marriage. Previously, marriage was a business transaction that was used in order to share wealth and connections between families. But around the start of the 19th century, there began to be more emphasis on marriages that were built on love. Since young women were also taught that marriage was their ultimate goal in life, eventually the entire thing became very idealized. Combine this with the fact that those who chose to marry found themselves highly dependent on their husbands due to a lack of legal rights like the ability to own property or vote, and suddenly the concern became not finding a man to marry, but finding the perfect man to marry. You needed to find a husband that you loved, who was able to financially support you, and who would respect your wishes and autonomy within the union. And this was easier said than done. These new standards would lead to many women deciding that either they would marry the best, or they wouldn't marry at all. In an 1889 issue of Tit Bits magazine, when asked why they chose to become a spinster, many ladies had very strong opinions on the matter. Here are some of their responses. Miss Sophia Drew writes, "As there are so many more women than men, we cannot all hope to marry. But please don't think that I am dissatisfied. I am now only a dairymaid. If married, I should be a wife, mother, nurse, housekeeper, chambermaid, seamstress, laundress, dairymaid, and scrub generally." Miss Florence Waite says, "Because I have other professions open to me in which the hours are shorter, the work more agreeable, and the pay possibly better." Miss Laura Bax argues, "Because matrimony is like an electric battery. When you once join hands, you can't let go, however much it hurts. And, as when embarked on a toboggan slide, you must go to the bitter ends, however much it bumps." And my personal favorite, submitted by a Miss Sparrow, says, "Because I do not care to enlarge my menagerie of pets, and I find the animal man less docile than a dog, less affectionate than a cat, and less amusing than a monkey." Damn, Miss Sparrow. Of course, it is important to note that this was a very white and middle-class idea. Choosing to become a spinster wouldn't have been easy for those from working-class backgrounds, or for people of color who didn't have families that were able to support them. But due to the aforementioned lack of men, spinsters were still on the rise in every social class. And if women weren't doing their job of getting married, then suddenly people began to wonder, what exactly were they going to do with all these single women? In 1869, English essayist William Rathbone Gregg published a work titled "Why Are Women Redundant?", a 40-page essay that detailed his concerns on the growing number of quote-unquote superfluous women. Now, aside from referring to women who were single by choice as having a so-called unwholesome preference, and claiming that their hearts must be unusually cold and their heads unusually astray, Gregg also included his own idea for a solution to this problem. All of these unmarried women should be sent to the other British colonies and become wives for the lonely settlers there. That way the population in both Britain and the colonies would be more evenly balanced. There were, however, a few problems with this plan, like finding out how you could send hundreds of thousands of women across the Atlantic, and the fact that most of these self-made spinsters were from middle or upper-class families, and you couldn't just force them onto a boat. Other writers like Frances Cobb disagreed with Gregg's extreme opinions on the matter, and instead rebutted with her own paper, "What Shall We Do with Our Old Maids?", an essay that provided some pretty level-headed ideas. Cobb argued that the old assumption that marriage was the sole destiny of woman, and that it was the business of her husband to afford her support, is brought up short by the statement that 1 woman in 4 is certain not to marry, and that 3 millions of women earned their own living at this moment in England. She pointed out that the old way of doing things just wasn't working for the current social landscape, and while emigration to find a partner might be the solution for some, the issue could also be dealt with by educating these women so that they could find something else to do with their lives. The kinds of things that Frances Cobb discusses are emblematic of one of the broader social issues in the Victorian era, known as the woman question. This wasn't exactly one specific question, but rather a term that was used to refer to any question when it came to women. Education, healthcare, voting rights, proper gender roles, the woman question made up all of these things. And within this new age of the spinster, it was more relevant than ever. The mid-19th century would see many early feminist groups using this issue of surplus women as a way to push for solutions that benefited women as a whole. Their main objective was better education, especially for those in the middle class who didn't have familial wealth to fall back on and weren't able to work in positions like domestic service due to social restrictions. By the 1870s, their efforts would see several colleges for women open in England, like Newman College and Somerville College. and gradually, some legacy institutions did allow small numbers of women to study there, but they were barred from taking final examinations, meaning that even though they completed the same amount of classwork as their male classmates, they wouldn't be given a degree by the end. But despite these imperfect results, the push for women's education was overall successful, and soon, by the late 1800s, a single woman suddenly had more options than ever before. There's a common misconception that prior to World War II, women never had to work. But this is not entirely true. There have always been women working. Lower-class women would have worked in domestic service, taking on roles like a maid, a midwife, or a laundress. Those who were married might have also assisted with a family business, helping to run a farm or a store, and more educated women might have found work as a governess or a teacher. In fact, in the mid-1800s, it's estimated that around 30 to 40% of women contributed significantly to their household income. But because of the way that census information was taken down, it was never properly recorded. It was common for a census to list a woman's marital status, categorizing her as single, married, or widowed, but not always if she was employed. And in some cases, even if she was, things like assisting in a family business or working smaller part-time jobs weren't considered significant enough to be recorded. In the 1850s, the rate of female employment would actually increase, beginning a span of about 30 years when the amount of working women would be higher than any other recorded number until the end of World War II. One industry that saw a lot of female workers was textiles, where jobs could be found in everything from spinning yarn to hat making. Factories also had tons of different jobs, but this work was grueling, dangerous, and did not pay particularly well. Sewing-related trades, on the other hand, were one of the few respectable positions for women, and working as a modiste or a milliner provided not only steady work, but also the independence that came with running a business. Some jobs that became popular towards the end of the century included clerical work like typing, or operating the telegraph and phone lines. Typewriting was particularly attractive for middle-class women, since not only was it socially respectable, but also in high demand and relatively cheap and quick to learn. Since the job was based around new technology, being a typist had a certain level of allure to it, being associated with a modern young woman in the big city. The archetype of the typewriter girl was also common in popular culture at the time, and was basically the Victorian equivalent of the sexy librarian. But there were still many barriers that women faced when it came to their employment. Opportunities could be limited, and concerns around them taking away jobs from men, or abandoning their traditional role in society, made social stigma and prejudice against working women a constant issue. They also earned considerably less than men did, in some cases only half as much as their male counterparts. And all of this was especially bad in male-dominated fields like science and medicine. But despite these setbacks, the ability to work opened up a whole new world for single women. Now marriage was not the only option, and becoming a spinster was not a precarious life sentence. While even today there is still some level of stigma around unmarried women, once again see the crazy cat lady, the efforts made advocating for female education and employment during this time would pave the way for future generations of women. And I think it's really unfortunate that in broader discussions of history, this age of female employment is often forgotten about. So, yes, according to Victorian sensibilities, I would be a spinster. But I'm okay with that, because it means I get to share discussions on topics like this with all of you. So, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more content like this, you can also subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on all the fun history videos of the future. But for now, I bid you farewell.